Why did Trump attack Venezuela and kidnap President Nicolas Maduro? Clearly wasn't anything to do with drugs. I think the Americans themselves have even given up on the pretense of that. It wasn't because he was in possession of machine guns, even though that's what he's ridiculously been charged with in American courts. Was it about the oil? Probably was. But there was a much bigger context, which I think is the bigger reason. The oil's always been there. What had changed? The US has hated Venezuela for a very long time, ever since Hugo Chavez came to power through multiple presidents. So why now? Why do they go now? I think to understand that, we need to look at the broader geopolitical context. And the story actually starts with China, because a critical strategic priority for the US through the Obama regime and the Trump regime and the Biden regime has been containment of China, trying to prevent China from emerging as a global power, a rival that could not be pushed around and dominated and controlled by the United States. And a key strategy for this was the trade war. And this trade war has been going on for some time, but it was Trump 2.0 that really kicked it off. And one of his key tactics in it was the launch of this tariffs war that he absurdly called Liberation Day, launched on April Fool's Day last year. So this was a thing where he, through some twisted logic, thinks the whole world's been ripping off the US, and as a result imposed tariffs on all sorts of countries, and made demands of them. You know, he was expecting their call, and if they didn't call and sort out something, do a deal, then these tariffs were going to go, and they were going to get higher and higher and higher. And so weaker countries were obliged to kind of buckle under this. Less weak but sycophantic countries also rolled over. I mean, the EU's response was just kind of, it would be really embarrassing if you were a European. They agreed in July that they would be tariffed by the US, but they wouldn't have any tariffs in return. And in return for the US imposing 15% tariffs on them, they would promise to spend a whole lot of money investing in the US and buying US military equipment and so on. It was the sort of deal that Tony Soprano would expect from a pizza parlor owner. So the Europeans rolled over, China didn't, and so the tariffs went up. And I think at one point Trump was talking about 140% tariff on China, thinking that he could push China into submission. The thing is that, unlike the start of the trade war, China had prepared for it and knew that there was another onslaught coming, and were not nearly as vulnerable as they had previously been. And so as the Americans turned up the heat, China bided its time, and there were some pretty big attacks. In September last year, there were two things in particular, neither of which got a lot of coverage in the mainstream Western media. One was that there was a company called Nexperia, based in Holland, owned by Chinese, a high-tech company with $3 to $4 billion. And at the request or insistence of the Americans, the Dutch confiscated it from its Chinese owners. The Dutch have a history of doing things like this. Like they have the latest technology and making latest generation computer chips. And they have gone along with American demands that none of this technology be shared with China. So they basically stole this company of China. In the same month, the US introduced a whole lot of other sanctions. There had been 1,300 companies, Chinese companies, sanctioned by the Americans. In September, they cranked this up to over 20,000 companies that were not allowed to do business with America or American companies. In response to these attacks, China responded. And one of the ways that they responded, the one that really rocked the Americans, was halting the export of rare earths. The whole American technology and military machine depends on rare earths, which China has the lion's share of the supplies of, and the US is entirely dependent on China in its military and its technology sectors on Chinese rare earths, and there was a total ban on them. This was in September. So when the APEC meeting came around in October last year, President Xi and President Trump had a meeting on the sidelines in Busan in South Korea. And this was the point where the US basically realized that they had lost. China held all the cards, and in order for the blocking of the rare earths to be lifted, the US agreed to tell the Dutch to give back Nexperia, to remove all of those extra sanctions they'd put on Chinese companies, and to reduce these ridiculous tariffs to right back down at the same level as the Europeans. And China's the adversary. Europe is supposed to be the friends and the allies, and China ended up with the same level of tariffs, 15%, which is kind of a normal level of tariff, as the Europeans, the sycophantic Europeans did. And in return, what did China do? They threw them a few soybeans. They said, oh, well, apart from the rare earths, they said, oh, well, we'll start buying your soybeans again, because they just went and got them somewhere else after the Americans put their trade sanctions on. And they also came to a deal with TikTok, which was really important for the Americans, as I've explained in a separate video. They didn't get the algorithm for TikTok, but they got the power to control the content of it in the United States. So the US got nothing. It was a total back down. Of course, Trump, as he did when the Houthis kicked them, gave them a kicking in the Red Sea, and then he pretended the Houthis were desperate for a ceasefire when it was the Americans. When Iran was bombarding Israel in ways that had never happened before, they pretended that Iran was desperate for a ceasefire. So Trump spun this as though, now we're not competitors with China, we're cohabiting with China. And he did all this stuff about, me and Xi, we should be the G2. I mean, President Xi never said anything about being G2 with the United States. But so this was it. So the Americans had basically met their match, that the Chinese had stared them down in the trade war and the tariff war. The other thing to remember about this agreement is that the supply of rare earths was agreed to be continued only for 12 months. It's going to be reassessed again in 12 months. So the US is in a difficult situation there. So that was October last year. In December last year, the US released its national security strategy. This is a document that every presidential kind of regime releases as a sort of a statement of how they see US national security. And in the past, it's been very much couched in terms of containment of China. This time, it was very different. This time, there was a revival of this thing called the Monroe Doctrine, which had never been talked about in previous ones. However many back they go, they weren't talking. Nobody was talking about the Monroe Doctrine, but this one they were. The Monroe Doctrine was actually developed like a few hundred years ago, and it essentially says that the Americas are the US sphere of influence, and that other rival global powers don't belong there, and shouldn't be there, and this is America's backyard. This is the United States backyard, and so whereas the original Monroe Doctrine was kind of a statement of intent of American power expanding, US power expanding, this one was more of a retrenchment. This one was saying that we can't control everything at a global level. We've seen the US trying to get NATO, the European nations, to carry the weight of NATO, and leaning more on its allies in Southeast Asia to do that work too, on Japan and Korea and Taiwan and so on. And what it's saying in terms of its view is that its sphere of influence is what it calls the Western Hemisphere. The Western Hemisphere essentially being the Americas. So it was a back down, starting from the Busan meeting with President Xi. It was a back down economically. It was a back down politically. Was it a back down militarily? Well, this is where I think a big part of the Venezuela thing came from, that here was Trump, who basically couldn't really, impose himself anymore over the whole world, but he could impose himself here. So a big part of that was flex. It was Trump flexing in South America, and he was flexing against a government that the Americans have always had beef with, and kind of demonstrating to the world that, okay, we don't control the whole world directly, but we control the Americas, we control our own backyard. The whole Greenland thing is a part of that too. I'll save that for another time. But at Canada. But essentially, it is asserting American control over the Americas, US control over the Americas, which is an interesting thing actually, because in the last decade or so, what you've seen is that so many countries in South and Central America have established trading relationships with China, and China has become the biggest trading partner with quite a few of them. And part of what this national security doctrine was saying is that we control this, and our adversaries have no place here. And you saw that with the Greenland rhetoric as well. We don't want any other great powers coming in here because this is part of the Western Hemisphere and this is our zone and nobody else is here. The difficulty that they have with South America is that because South American countries are so economically connected now with China, it's going to be incredibly difficult to disrupt all that. And already we've seen a hint of that. Javier Milei, who's the crazy kind of far-right libertarian president of Argentina, who, when he was first elected, was saying, we're not going to have anything to do with China. They pulled China out of anything to do with BRICS and Belt and Road, and so not going to do anything. just in the last week or so, he's been making overtures to China saying, oh, we're a reliable country to do business with and do trade with and so on. Because economically they're in serious trouble, even though the Americans have bailed them out with tens of billions of dollars to stop them actually hitting the wall and going bankrupt again. They can't afford to not have anything to do with China. And so there you have a country that is the most ideologically aligned with the United States, that can't afford to kind of keep China out. So this whole repositioning of the US is with the Western Hemisphere is an important development, and it's going to be increasingly difficult, I think, for the Americans to kind of maintain this control. One of the difficulties they've got is that their only way for getting people to stay with them is to threaten them if they don't. And that's not nearly as powerful as, rewarding them if they do. But how can the US reward them? They reward them by not punishing them. I mean, again, we're getting back to Tony Soprano territory. The incentives for countries to defy the US and do trade with China are just too high. So I think what we've seen is that although you see these lash outs in different places, this is definitely the US empire in decline. And unfortunately, declining empires don't go quietly. They lash out. They become incredibly violent and quite irrational. And that's what we're seeing in the US. And so I fear for what might come next, actually. I think 2026 is going to be a very challenging year in the geopolitical sphere.